Welcome all of you to Dr. Charles H. Long's talk, Dilemmas of American Religion. The Holocaust, Genocide and Interfaith Education Center, which I'm a director of, and also assistant professor of religious studies. Both of my associations and affiliations at this college have sponsored this event today. So I'm very proud to be part of that and also to create the union of the center with my department. The center's mission is to promote Jewish, Catholic, Muslim discussion and collaboration, as urged in 1965 by the Vatican's Nostra Aetate, in our time, and seconded in subsequent papal actions and declarations. And I quote, "Since Christians and Jews have such a common spiritual heritage, this sacred council wishes to encourage and further mutual understanding and appreciation." Nostra Aetate also states that the Church, quote, "regards with esteem also the Muslim," and it urges all to work sincerely for mutual understanding. And that is part of the mission statement for the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center. We focus on the lessons of Holocaust. However, we also reflect the spirit of the center's mission and vision that all foci are interconnected and are part of the educational outreach of the center. The center is committed to understanding, respecting differences, similarities between people of all religions, races, ethnicities, and nationalities. Please visit our website, which is www.hgimanhattan.com, and take a flyer for our next event, which is right there, which is the 7th Annual Frederick Schweitzer Lecture on November 5th. And it's going to be given by Dr. Murray Baumgarten from UC Santa Cruz. We'll also announce a panel on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, how to discuss religious extremism, on October 20th in the Kelly Commons. The room has to be confirmed. And yesterday I got a call from Katrina Sweat-Lantos, the daughter of Tom Lantos, who is the only Hungarian survivor in our Congress in the United States, who is going to come here on September 22nd, and just out of her will and goodness, going to talk about anti-Semitism. And that will be in the alumni room at 5 o'clock. Today is 9/11, and I want us to remember all the victims of 9/11. On 9/11, 19 men hijacked 4 fuel-loaded commercial airlines bound for West Coast destinations. A total of 2,977 people were killed in New York City, Washington, D.C., and outside of Shanksville, Pennsylvania, in the worst terrorist attack in U.S. history. But today we also remember those thousands of civilians and soldiers that have been killed in the many wars that have continued in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan post 9/11. At a crucial time like this, when religion, and especially Islam and Muslims, have been labeled as a religion of a group of people that have gone beyond the civilized, or a religion that cannot be accepted in the civilized West, it has only gotten worse. The images of ISIS remind us of the Taliban. Media and political pundits have framed the images of Hamas, ISIS, and the Taliban side by side. And there's no counterpoint, none at all. No voice that cries out amongst the debris of an Islam in ruins. It is this debris that we must clean up, whether through real conversation, action, and critique. A self-examination, or as the Sufis and the Quran states, tazkiyah, to look within oneself, should be at the forefront of our minds today. It is precisely at this moment and at this time that we need intellectuals like Charles H. Long to remind us, deconstruct, and reconstruct the very idea of religion, religions, and religious. 9/11 is here again, but we are far from any clarity about what happened, why it happened, and the course of intellectual and compassionate action that perhaps we should have taken. The idea of the other, or others, has deepened. As we call ourselves globalized, we are more and more intellectually isolated and poor, not just in our pockets, but in our hearts. We have yet to hear the message of history and religion. We have yet to stand up for one another. We have yet to scream out and say justice and humanity should prevail. But we are deafened, deeply, deeply deafened, by the screaming silences of poverty, genocide, and injustices all over the world. As Charles H. Long would quote Ludwig Wittgenstein, a phrase that he used in many seminars years ago when I was a student, "The world is all that is the case." The world is all that is the case. It is upon this phrase that we should sit and ponder, what is this world? Who are in this world? Especially in terms of religion. Who are those that we call terrorists, extremists, and barbaric? It is as Long wrote in Significations in chapter 6. He says, "I use the phrase empirical others to define a cultural phenomenon in which the extraordinariness and uniqueness of a person or culture is first recognized negatively. However, because the recognition of the person or culture is necessary for interpreters of cultural identity, various stratagems of description and or diagnosis are employed to represent the other in relationship." The various definitions that have paralyzed how we experience or create meanings that might have religious significance has been lost and buried under the nonsense of empty rhetoric and geopolitics. Do we not wonder anymore? Do we not question anymore? As I do wander further, I do want to say a few personal words about my mentor and friend, Dr. Charles H. Long, who I met many years ago when I was an undergraduate at Syracuse University. I remember the first time I met him was in 1989 as an undergraduate, many years ago. I had won the undergraduate essay award called Religion in a Different Light for $250, which is a lot of money. This was my first encounter with Dr. Long. As a religion English major and a minor in psychology, I was intrigued by my own religion, Islam. I knew what it was at home and how to practice and read the Quran, but I wanted to discover my own history. So I took Dr. Long's class on Marshall Hodgson, Venture of Islam. It was through this man, this African-American historian of religion, that I became fascinated with the historical and religious debates that I have now within Islam. It takes perhaps another to explore sometimes our most intimate and spiritual aspects. Thank you, Dr. Long. Thank you. I would like to say a few words about Dr. Long's accomplishments, but I won't take too long. Charles Long, prior to his retirement in September 1996, held faculty positions as Professor of Historians of Religions at the University of Chicago, William Rand Keaton, Junior Professor of History at Religions at the University of North Carolina, Professor of History of Religion at Duke University, the Jeanette K. Watson Professor of History of Religions at Syracuse University, a Professor of History of Religion, and Director of the Research Center for Black Studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. At the University of Chicago, he studied with the pioneer of the development of the study of history of religions in the United States, Professor Joachim Bloch. He later joined with Professor Mircea Eliade and Joseph Kitagawa in establishing the international scholarly journal, History of Religions. This journal and the discipline as formed in Chicago were major forces in the establishment of the study of religion in the United States. He has a unique perspective from which to speak of the general meaning of religion in history and culture, and specifically about African religions in the Atlantic world. Long, along with a group of his colleagues at the University of Chicago, he was a member and subsequently served as chair of the History of Religions field and the Committee on African Studies, respectively, at the University of Chicago. He has been involved in the training of 3 generations of scholars in religion and African American studies. His books include Alpha, The Myths of Creation, The History of Religions, Myth and Symbols, Essays in Honor of Morgiolade, and Signification, Signs, Symbols, and Images in the Interpretation of Religion. Some of my students have read from it. He was also a founding member of the American Society for the Study of Religion and the Society for the Study of Black Religion. In 1973, he was president of the American Academy of Religion. His work is devoted to the meaning of religion in the formation of the Atlantic world. Long relocates the issue of religion within the structures of the Atlantic formation. This cultural geographical formation of the New World System and the Atlantic world enables us to understand religion and African American religions as distinctively new and creative meaning of the modern world. He is presently working on the publication of another book of essays tentatively titled Ellipsis, and a book-length study of religion which is entitled Orientations. Let us please welcome Dr. Charles H. Long.
Thank you very much. I like the introduction. As a matter of fact, it's going so good that I didn't want to disturb. I have a speech written out here, but I don't like to read to people, and so I will talk most of this, but every now and again I'll look at the page. So I don't like to read because I get tied up with my reading and I can't see you. And when I'm lecturing or when I'm talking to you, I can sense whether or not you're understanding what I say. If you don't, I try to put it another way so you might get it. First off, let me say that I am a historian of religion. I'm not a theologian, nor am I a church historian. It's from this point of view that I want to talk about religion, and from this point of view I want to talk about America, these 2 words. We tend to think that we know what religion is in a kind of day-by-day way. If, for the most part, if somebody asks us, what is religion about, most of us would say it's about God, or something like that, and hope that people will go away. The word religion itself is of ancient vintage. It's from the Latin. There are 2 forms of it in Latin. One is religio, and the other one is religare. One, religare, means to tie, to bind, very much in the same way as you tie your shoe, to bind something together. And the other word, religio, meant to be serious in whatever undertaking you went about. That is, to add some gravitas to whatever. Now you'll notice that in Latin, they have lots of words for God. Deo, Deus, Dei, they know what the word God is. But they don't use it the way we use it. So we get our word religion and we think it has to do with God. The Romans say, well, we had a word for that. If we wanted you to have that word, we'd be giving it to you. But you don't say theology. You say religion. So how did that come about? First off, let me say a word or two about this word religion. It is not the case that everyone in the world from time immemorial had something they call religion. Religion is, as a term and as a usage, is relatively new. It's only since the Protestant Reformation that the term religion, or its equivalent in the various European languages, became a word of common parlance. Prior to this time, especially among most Christians, they never used the word religion to talk about what Christianity was. They usually talked about the faith or the path of Jesus. I am going the way of Christ, but they hardly ever used the term religion. It was only in the Reformation that the term religion came to the fore. And it came to the fore when Martin Luther, in his debate with John Eck at Worms, because Luther was a monk, and he had the effrontery to challenge the Pope on indulgences and certain practices that he thought were against the way of Christ. What happened was, at this debate, of course, he was outsmarted. I mean, Eck was so much brighter than he was, and he was older. And he'd been doing this quite a bit. And Eck just beat him up in the disputation. And at a certain point, Luther, sort of did what they used to call in my day, play nothing ball. He said, "Here I stand. God help me, I can do no other." Now, what does that do? What that did was to give a basis for the meaning of his ultimate orientation in life to his inwardness. Now, Christians have always had the notion that there were two forms of life, one an inner life and the external life. And both of these were under the control of God. But under control of God meant under control of God through his church. And Luther now broke that control of the inner life. Now, the inner life was not ego, or what we would call ego. The inner life was that, as we would put it in the Gospel of John, it's that light with everybody who comes into the world. But it is individually, just for that person. I know when I was studying in Africa, among the Iwe, the Akan, they have the meaning of a person. There are certain things that come from the mother, there are certain things that come from the father, and then there is a certain thing that comes directly from Nyami, and that is called head. Head. And that is given to each person has his own God, head. And one can never violate this God. And this is the same thing. I was reminded of this in reading Luther. That one cannot violate this God. Because the violation of this God is like committing suicide. All right. So when Luther does this, he opens the door to a form of authority and meaning that was outside of the church. An ultimate form of meaning that was outside of the church. Now, what this ended up doing is opening the floodgates so that everybody who had a notion about what was going on had a right to say, I believe this, I believe that. And this is what religion, that is, in the various parts of the European, of Europe, where human beings had been exposed to some teachings about the church or something about the Gospels or heard something. You have to remember, most people are illiterate now, and everything they hear, they get it right, they get it wrong, and then they mixed it up with all the stories they had before the folks came talking about Jesus and so on. So you had all this going on, and they ended up being what sociologists in the United States start calling the folkways and mores of the people. The folkways and mores of the people. Everybody had a certain kind of way of talking about these things in the various little cultures and hamlets. And this became the meaning that religion took on in the European, in the post-European, post-Reformation European world. And that's when the usage started that you have religion. Now, there's one other thing I want to bring up in relation to the problematic of religion, and that is that was occasioned by a book edited by two political scientists in England. It was called Civil Society, History and Possibilities. Now, in this book, there are chapters on civil societies from almost every culture in the world, in South America, in Germany, in England, in Greece, you name it. But strangely enough, there's no chapter on civil society in the United States. Now, you would think that if you're going to write anything about a civil society, I mean, my goodness, the United States is as big and bad as I mean, it's not the thing to snuff at, you see. So you've got to have a chapter on the United States. You know, get the first chapter, as a matter of fact. But there's not one. So I said, why is that? It's because, for the most part, we don't generally talk about civil society in the United States. Europeans always talk about civil society. You go and read a book, and you can read the book from cover to cover on the politics of the United States or whatever. You don't hardly ever see the phrase civil society. But you go to Germany, you go to England, you go to Italy. Oh, they always talk about civil society. Now, why? In this country, we talk about civil religion. Now, why is it that in a country where your constitution, tells you that the government cannot impose religion on you, why in the world would anybody be talking about a civil religion in a country where you have this, you get a politician who says, there's this wall between church and state. So why is that? But we're the ones who talk about civil religion. Europeans never, ever talk about civil religion when they're talking about themselves. Never, ever. They wouldn't know what you meant by it. If you try to apply the term civil religion to Germany or England or Scotland, what the hell, where are you coming from? So I leave those in the background, and we'll come back because they raise some interesting issues regarding the meaning of religion in America. Now I'm going to say some things you already know, but I'm going to put them together in a different way. The United States of America
is a continental nation state, but this was not always the case. Beginning with the revolution waged against their mother country, England, in the late 18th century, the nation evolved over the next 2 centuries into a nation bordered on the north by Canada, on the south by Mexico, and set between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. 2 non-contiguous territories, Alaska and Hawaii, completed as a nation containing 50 states. This nation state is contained within North America, which is a part of the Western Hemisphere, the landmass west of Europe across the Atlantic, which contains other territories and states of Meso and South America. I state these simple facts as one of the bases for considering a meaning of religion within the temporal geographical area referred to as America. In other words, I want you to talk, when I want to talk about religion, I want you to talk about where it is. See? It's not just floating around in the sky somewhere. Where is it? It's here in America. What is America? This is what America is. While this essay is centered upon the potential entity of the United States of America, contextual considerations warrant attention to the broader meanings evoked by the appearance of America and Americans on the world scene. There are certain modes of the given and the a priori nature occasioned by the name and meaning of this space. These modes serve as background and evoke the deeper structures of the cultures of this space where human actions have taken place. Ferdinand Braudel, in his great book, The Mediterranean World in the Time of Philip II, introduced the notion of 3 rhythms of history. He called, there's an environmental geographical history, and there is it is slow moving. It's the history that would be, what will we say, the history of mountains, the history of geography, and he called this the longue durée. And then there's a history of the time of groups and groupings, the people who live in the geographical area. And then there is the history of events, the short-term history of human beings and what they've done. And this is a fast-moving history. Now, this layer of history he called the eventual meaning of history. These layers of time are easy to locate in the Mediterranean. The passage in the Mediterranean world, for it is very old location of many and diverse human passages for well over 3 millennia. As I put it once, the Mediterranean Sea is also a womb for the gestation and birth of gods. From the ancient Egyptians through the Jews and Christians to Mithra, Zoroaster, and Islam. The Atlantic world is very different. It introduces us to the globalization of humanity. The Atlantic, however, is not a revealer of gods or deities, or seers or prophets. It is not under the sign of revelation, of revelational meanings. It is under the sign of rational orders. It manifests no regard for the layered thickness of time. It is a world justified by the epistemologies of Descartes and Kant, the English empiricists, and the ethical economies of Adam Smith and Karl Marx. Now, in this, you see that there's a very different sense of what the Atlantic world makes possible as over against the other kind of world that we knew of in the West, and that was the Mediterranean. You go to the Mediterranean, it's deep, it's thick, it's all kind of junk floating around everywhere. Whereas in the Atlantic world, everything tends to be slick. Now, in spite of these dissimilarities, certain hints may be derived from Borel that will help us to decipher the distinctive meaning of a religious orientation arising from the Atlantic world in North America. Though America does not appear in the guise of the Mediterranean, its spatial geography does not, however, express a state or stable meaning in relationship to the spatial and temporal orders of the people and cultures in the land. We have, when I was at Syracuse, I ran into this wonderful man, geographer, Don Miney, who I discovered was writing a geographical history of the United States. And he did it. He did it. He did it. 4 volumes. If you ever get a chance, buy those volumes. And if you ever get in jail, take them with you to read. Because they're really kind of wonderful things and a nice way to spend your time learning about where you live. The religious issue here is not so much one of transcendence in the Atlantic world, but rather an awareness of those unchanged and are ever so slowly changing realities of created orders upon which we are dependent. These given orders of creation not only undergird and sustain, but are equally reflected and refracted in the symbolic and imaginative structures of our human relationship and the societies we live in. So for the discussion this afternoon, I will be define these meanings, these meanings as religious, and by religion I mean orientation. By orientation, I shall be referring to the manner in which a culture, society, or person becomes aware of their place in the temporal spatial order of things. Implied in the term is a recognition of the powers that accrue to the specificities of the modes of being that are coincidental with the situation. Orientation expresses creativity and critique in the face of the given orders of creation. This is not a simple task. It is by its very nature a dialectical process, for it is precisely in the act of creating one's world that the world is understood as having been already given. So to the extent that you feel you made your world, the more you think you made your world, the more you find out that the world was given before you even got to make it. So that's a funny thing that goes on. I spend a lot of time listening to physicists, and they always are talking. I like physicists. My best friend is in graduate school with physics. But anyway, they talk about the Big Bang, you know, the Big Bang. And it always got me. I said, well, what do you think? Well, I mean, you think you settled it? I said, I'm like a 2-year-old. Where'd the Big Bang come from? In other words, I'm never going to stop asking where'd that come from. It will never stop, because there's something given to, once you start creating something, you realize that there's something given before you start creating. What better way to speak of the voyages of Columbus and most of the later explorers and discoverers. I'm going to skip all that. I was talking about Columbus and how they thought they discovered America, but America was already here before they discovered. I want to now speak about the 3 races that inhabit the United States, and I want to do this by reference to Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America. De Tocqueville was a French, and he was of nobility, but he was, and he came to the United States in the 1830s, and he came to observe. He didn't come here to live. He said, I've heard of this place over there, you supposedly have a democracy, and I want to see what it looks like. Because we had a revolution here, and we've been having trouble trying to make another kind of society. And maybe if I saw what you were doing, maybe I could get a little hint about what we ought to be doing. And but he had a great feeling of real regard for the king and nobility, just as the English did, because they didn't think that just ordinary rabble-rousing type people who had all their little funny folkways and mores had sense enough to know how to run a country. See? And that still bears, you know, thinking about it, especially in this place. As Mr. Lincoln said, you know, people didn't know whether they could run the country or not. And the jury's still out. But anyway, de Tocqueville came in the 1830s, and he came with a friend, Beaumont. And they traveled from Georgia up through New England, and he wrote this wonderful book. As a matter of fact, it's still one of the best books about the United States. And it's not a book written by an American, it's a book written by an American. And it's called Democracy in America. And you should buy that book and read it too. If you're going to get another term in jail. But in book 2 of Democracy in America, he talks about the 3 races that occupy the land. And I want to settle in. Because most American historians never, ever talk about the 3 races that inhabit the land. I went through a whole lot of American history, and I looked at textbooks. I looked at textbooks that were being used from 1930 on, all over the country. Nobody talks about the 3 races that inhabit the land. It was this French guy, writing in 1830, who came over here to try to figure out what democracy was, who talked about the 3 races that occupy the land. The land as geographical space has been the constant ingredient shared by all these collectivities. The 3 races are the Aboriginal populations, the Europeans who immigrated here and colonized, and the Africans who were brought from Africa as enslaved persons. Each group possessed a very different perception of and practice of the land. Now, the land is what is important here. It's what all of these groups have in common. The Aboriginal populations, their land. The Europeans, they say, their land. The Africans, their land, because they're working. So that's the land. We're still talking about religion. The original inhabitants of the land, known by another misconceived misnomer as Indians, had already been in this land for over 1,000 years when the first Europeans arrived. The land was held in common by the entire group in the culture of the specific Aboriginal society. The land was not possessed as real estate and thus could not be bought or sold. The Aboriginal populations possessed both tacit and empirical knowledge of the land. Such knowledge was expressed not only in rituals and beliefs, but was a pervasive aspect of their everyday existence. For the Aboriginal populations, the land performed a mutual orientation. It oriented them to their world, and they in turn served the land through the preservation of its orientation in space. Beginning as a series of English colonial settlements dating from the early 17th century, the colonists became independent through a revolution in the latter part of the 18th century, and since became a nation, and since then this became a nation of immigrants. primarily from Europe. In the middle colonies, primarily Virginia and the Carolinas, through the activities of Richard Atwood, whose writings about North America can best be described as combining travel literature with real estate promotion, urgent investments in charter companies promoting ventures in Virginia and the Carolinas. The land is portrayed as paradisal. As Bernard Sheehan put it in regard to Hakluyt's rhetoric, he says, the effulgence of the rhetoric and the prediction that wealth will be obtained with or without art or man's help contain profound paradisal implications. Sheehan continued with a comment about Hakluyt's collaborator Samuel Purchas. He had traveled on 3 continents, but held Virginia to be the natural endowment, the finest place for an earthly paradise. So that was this whole notion of, for the Europeans, you invest in there and come over here and you get rich and you live in paradise. Roderick Nash relates how William Bradford stepped off the Mayflower into what he called a hideous and dangerous wilderness. So you got these 2 sides. From the time of Bradford to the present, the wilderness theme became a feature of American culture and practice and rhetoric. The wilderness is an example of the New World as both threatening and sinister on the one hand and fascinating on the other. One of the most influential books on the American culture and religion was Perry Miller's Errand into the Wilderness, and it brought about a renaissance in religious meetings in America. Since the Aboriginal populations were not a part of a city tradition of the Europeans, they were identified with the wilderness. They were therefore threatening realities to be avoided or overcome. The European metaphoric language ranges from wilderness to virgin to paradise. In spite of the force of settlers in New England and the middle colonies, they were able to work out a way of understanding and cooperating with the Aborigines in the early years of their immigration. Now, in the early years, you remember the little Thanksgiving story, and the little Thanksgiving story is always very nice. You have English people, you know, little funny hats, and then you have Native Americans, and they call it, and then they all have a good time and Thanksgiving, pumpkins, etc. But then after that, you don't hear anything about these folks. So what happened to the feathers? You don't hear them. Anyway. So the Aboriginal populations disappear. I have a note here that I shouldn't talk to. But different meanings have come out here in the last 2 or 3 decades. There are historians now who don't talk about the English, especially in New England and Virginia, as simply immigrants. They were invaders, and they have really good documents. Documents have always been there. Nobody just wanted to talk about it. Now, in his novel, The Compass Man, Herman Melville coined the phrase, the metaphysics of Indian hating. It is clear that many observers equate the violence against those of non-European racial groups to the experience of the English or the colonial period. Ralph Slotkin, in a series of studies, has taken up the theme of violence as one of the basic ingredients in the formation of Anglo-American culture. In his work, he traced the theme of violence from the colonial period through the 20th century. Violence is not simply the physical act of harm, but the rhetoric and institutional languages for many American institutions and practices. In 1619, a Dutch ship arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, with 20 African persons aboard, including men, women, and children. They were sold as indentured serfs. But this initial form of limited servitude of Africans opened the door to the full-fledged and total enslavement of millions of Africans and Portuguese colonists from the continent of Africa. The Africans in America constitute an involuntary presence in the land of the three races of people. They are the only group that did not wish to be here and were brought to this country bound and chained. Some form of slavery extended in every part of the country, with most of it being in the South, where plantation society became the normal mode of most Southerners. The enslaved Africans worked the land that was neither their own nor the land of those who had enslaved them. Their relationship with the land was highly ambiguous, being at once the reality that opposed them in the act of labor and at the same time allowing in this labor for a direct relationship with the form of irreducible intimacy of reality that defied the intervention of the owner. In other words, the land was often a better meaning of reality than the folks who owned them. As a matter of fact, it was a sense of the fundamental meaning of something more powerful, more durable, more understandable than the people who owned it. In addition, and as a corollary to the economic value of the institution of slavery, was the symbolic and political effects of its existence in the colonies and later the United States. I can read this in now. With the legitimation of slavery by the Constitution of the United States, I think we ought to get that point very good. That our great Constitution legitimated slavery. Our great Constitution of freedom legitimated slavery. One would have thought that once you fought England and the Declaration of Independence, and you had slavery, you said, we're going to get rid of this. No, we made it legal, legitimate. And it's been our problem ever since. One of our great historians, Ira Berlin, tells us that there are two kinds of societies as far as slavery is concerned. Societies with slaves and slave societies. What distinguishes them is that in societies with slaves, the enslaved are marginal to the central productive processes. In societies with slaves, no one presumed the master-slave relationship to be the social exemplar. In slave societies, slavery stood at the center of economic production, and the master-slave relationship provided the model for all social relations: husband and wife, parent and child, employee and employer, teacher and student. From the most intimate to the most public relationship, the archetype of slavery reigned. No relationship lay outside this group. And that needs to be understood because the meaning of slavery has permeated every aspect of this nation state we call the United States. So just the existence of slavery per se, but the very fact that it was legitimated by the Constitution means that anything dealing with the Constitution one way or another refers back to the stylistic structure of slavery as a form of its legitimation. In other words, the Constitution would never have been adopted if it had not legitimated slavery. Now, while the three races that constitute this culture have been in constant relation since the coming, and we share the same geographical space, the problem of America has always been around the land and these three races of people. The three races of people, including the subsequent continued migration of other people into the country. Now, there has been a discussion of another meaning of religion in America, which is not the kind of denominations of various Christian or Jewish or other groups from various parts of the world, but an religion in America which is a part and parcel of the civil society, what Robert Bellah called a civil religion. Bellah's discussion of a civil religion dealt mainly with the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and that kind of thing. There's another way of looking at the meaning of civil religion, which includes everybody in the land. And Bellah doesn't want to touch that, because Bellah wants to talk about it simply and only in terms of this being a European country. And he doesn't want to deal with what is the case and what has been the case ever since Europeans first landed here. I'm going to end there, and I hope something will come up in the discussions, because I don't want to get past Dr. Hadrides' strict rules.
Thank you so much, Dr. Long. Today we're going to do a couple of things. We are going to have questions from the audience, but we first have actually a colleague of mine and a student of Dr. Long that happened to be in the neighborhood, and he's going to respond for a few minutes. So let's welcome Dr. Richard to the podium.
Last night, Dr. Afridi, Professor Long, and I were at a restaurant down in Manhattan. And we were sitting on the outside of the restaurant. And we found out that if you're going to smoke a cigarette, you can't smoke a cigarette in that space outside the restaurant. There is, however, a little divider that is like a few feet away, and if you step on the other side of that divider, you can stand there and smoke. So you could have your plate of food in front of you sitting on a table. It would be inside the line if you're smoking a cigarette, if you're outside the line. And it's okay. But as soon as you step inside that line, it's illegal. Now, I'm not giving any kind of moral outrage about this situation. I just found it kind of funny. But this issue of drawing lines isn't always funny, ha-ha. It's always peculiar, but it's not always humorous. Many times when lines get drawn, blood gets drawn. And this is the case for America. I think one of the things I learned from Dr. Long's talk today, that I also learned from Dr. Long generally, when I was a student of his, was that America is very much the problem of America, the dilemma of America, and the dilemma of modern subjectivity are very much the same. The dilemma of the modern self. I think when you mentioned Luther today, he hinted at that. This dilemma shows up in the philosophers, it shows up in Kant, it shows up in Descartes, it shows up in a different way in Adam Smith and Marx. But there's a prehistory, sort of, to this philosophical reflection. In other words, what Descartes came up with didn't really just sort of come out of the stove. There was a history to that. Descartes was raised in a Jesuit sect. He was familiar with Spanish philosophers of the previous century. And these Spanish philosophers, when they were philosophizing, it was not just an abstract issue. There was something real going on, and what was real that was going on had to do with the New World, and it had very much to do with drawing lines. There was one debate in particular between Las Casas and Juan Inés de Sepulveda that was all about the humanity of the Indians. And Professor Long was talking about how this world, this notion of the land as wilderness, and the people on the land itself being associated with that wildness, and they became a threat that had to be removed before civilization could occur. Well, in this debate, actually, Las Casas brings up that some of these folks, they have cities. They live in cities. They're civilized people, and Sepulveda comes back and says, they have, this is true, a republican institutional structure, but no one possesses anything as their own. Not a house, not a field at their disposal to lease in their will to their heirs. Notice, this is not about sitting on a place and using it while you're alive. This is about having the kind of ownership that you pass on to someone else. This is about being able to dispose of something as your own. Not taking care of this piece of land while you're here, but being able, if you want to, you can destroy it, you can use it up, you can pass it on to your heirs, you can do anything. This is the kind of thing he's talking about. And this, the fact that they have nothing of their own, subjects them to the will and caprice of their rulers rather than their own liberty. All this is an absolutely clear indication of the submissiveness and slavish mindset of these savages. So, the fact that they didn't have property that they could dispose of made them then not quite human. Not quite human. It certainly meant that the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire should approve a war on these people. Now, you go to the notion of the modern individual, the free individual, the site of freedom. In Descartes, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. Where the line gets drawn between, not between a world which, as in the Mediterranean, is full of gods, is alive, has powers of its own, but really a dead world of nature. A world that's inert, a world that can't move itself, a world that can only be moved from the outside. And this includes, apparently, people who are subject to the will and caprice of rulers. Or as Columbus said, these folks, he said, they'll do anything that you command them to do. Right. This line gets drawn not only within people, which Descartes always had a problem figuring out where to draw it. One time he drew it on the pineal gland. He knew that on the other side, right, he was subject to all kinds of causes that had nothing to do with his free will. He called this the passions. So not only was this a line that's drawn within people, but it's a line drawn between people. And the three races that end up occupying the world called America that line gets drawn between those races, and it begins to get drawn the minute Columbus shows up. And while Columbus was doing this, the Portuguese were also down in West Africa, what they called Guinea. And they were encountering people down there, and they were having some of the same kinds of impressions. They had run into people, as Columbus did. They couldn't fit into their story. These people were not, Catholics. They were not some sect that they could identify. They were not Jews. They were not Muslims. And they weren't idolaters. Because what they could see as idolatry, which had come to them from classical Greece and Rome, wasn't there either. Columbus, they had none of this stuff. None of this stuff. And the Portuguese traders noticed this same thing. These people they have none of this stuff. They're not even idolaters. They have no religion at all. But what they do have came to be called the fetish. But this notion of the fetish actually emerged out of the interaction between these Portuguese traders and these people down there. And Dr. Long has talked a lot about this in the past. But this is what happens is a certain movement that devalues these others as they are being incorporated into this Atlantic world in two different ways. Now, there is, in this whole history, a series of what I'd like to call lost possibilities. And in the longer paper that, if we had world enough time, Professor Long would have completed, he mentioned one of these lost possibilities. And it's from a book by a guy named Stephen Saunders Webb. It's called 1676, The End of American Independence. Another good book to read in jail. And it's about Bacon's revolt, which was a time when there was a possible moment of alliance between all three of these groups in North America against the British. But Africans were involved in this against the British. The Iroquois were involved in it. And the colonists were involved in it. But partly because of what followed in King Philip's War, the colonists became really anxious about their ability to survive without being British subjects, and they began to identify more and more with, as colonials, with the mother country, and even after the Revolution did. And this more or less sealed the fate of this situation, this dilemma that we are still in, which even is still the dilemma of ourselves as subjects, as modern subjects. So, what I wanted to leave with Professor Long as just an open question is what to say a little bit more about what the lost possibility means for us today. Because it seems to me that the lost possibility, many people say, well, that's just the past is past, it's over and done with. But the lost possibility can be something else. The lost possibility can be a road not taken. And it can be a road that is still, not in its details, but in some way open. It can be a kind of fabulation of a world that could be different than the world we have now, than the world we have created. Not by rushing forward always into the new, but by gazing again at the past in detail and asking, when this decision was made, what other decisions could have been made? How can we make different decisions?
Okay, as tradition at Manhattan College, I'm going to ask one of our students to ask the first question. Morgan.
Do you think that the before us Americans can begin to, can you go? Do you think that before us Americans can understand Islam and the issue within the community, we have to understand the issues among our own major religions? Such as in America, such as Christianity and...
Can you understand Islam? I mean, I don't get the question.
I mean, in terms of the history of Islam and the major issues that are being faced in Islamic countries and even in our country in terms of...
I don't know. I don't know are you asking whether I think that people in America are capable of understanding what's going on among Muslims in Islamic lands? Is that what you're asking?
Well, I think in terms of being more empathetic towards what's going on there. Like when we look at the media and what we see is journalists being murdered or...
Yeah. I don't know about being empathetic because that's a kind of funny term. I would say it's possible to understand, to come to some understanding of what's going on. But you won't do that if you simply look at TV. TV will just give you some junk. And you hardly ever get a real sense of what the real issues are. Because TV producers know that they have to create these little stories and sell them every day. And they just pick up stuff from here, there, and yonder and try to get their stories sold. And they leave out what's most important. They don't explain in any adequate way what's behind anything. So the first thing I think we should do is just stop looking at TV about anything serious. I mean, there's some nice movies or something like that. But anything serious, forget TV. And then learn how to read and learn how to think. As a matter of fact, reading is thinking. There's no distinction. Some people think there is, but there isn't. And so you can think, you can think without reading, but you cannot read without thinking. Students used to come to me and prove they had read something, and I say, how do I know you read that? And they show me, well, you got to be here in yellow. You mean just put something in yellow, means you read it? It's a strange thing. I know you read it if I can ask you something about it, and you have thought about it. That's what it is. Okay, but that's the only way I know how to do that. I really talk to people who have real interest in these things and who can give you another perspective from which to approach.
I think we had a question from the alumnus.
Thanks very much.
Yes.
You mentioned that the Constitution of the United States legitimated or legitimized slavery.
Yes.
I think that's completely false. I think the Constitution contained, both in the body and in all of its amendments, the seeds of freedom for all of us. As the pledge says, liberty and justice for all. When Lincoln declared war in the Civil War, he did not have to repeal any part of the Constitution. And the 13th and 14th Amendments, which you might bring up, did not repeal or rescind any part of our Constitution.
Of course they did.
I would encourage everybody here to read
Why would they need it?
the Constitution and the debates leading up to the Constitution, with particular attention to the use of the word peoples and people. And you will find out that what you said was,
Well,
I would call it an overreach at least.
No, it's not an overreach. I think that most American historians who have any significance would agree with me and not you. And so I'm not going to argue the point since it's so obvious.
Then how do we have freedom without denying and rescinding and repealing
Well, if you read
parts
the
of the
Constitution where it mentions property,
Where it mentions what?
property, the property, and the whole notion of the basis for representation.
Exactly.
It has to do with 3/5 of this ambiguous property, which are human beings, are counted as a person. Now, whom do you think they're talking about?
Well, who do you think it helped? It helped the Union, not the southern states, not the slaveholding states. That 3/5 thing.
It didn't help the people who were enslaved.
Yes, it did, because it
You are out of your mind.
weakened the influence. Sir, it weakened the influence of the southern states by lowering their representative power.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to move on to
Not
another
5
question.
minutes.
Have a good time.
Possibly. Does anyone have another question in
Great
the
time.
audience? Right here. Helen.
Is there anybody working seriously on, I think one of our big problems as a country is that we don't have a defined civil society. We have tremendous diversity, but we don't have enunciated and clearly a defined set of mores and folkways and ways of interacting that would be the equivalent of what you call a civil society in England or in France.
Well, I think you're quite right about that, and I think that that's been a big argument within the country for a long time. As a matter of fact, just to say something about the South that is not totally bad, being a Southerner myself, one of the arguments that was being made in the 1930s by a group of Southern intellectuals, the agrarians, was precisely a critique of what they call Northern industrial society. They felt that coming out of the old plantation systems, that a kind of civil society had been made in the South. Whereas in the North, because it was industrial and you were getting all these funny new people from Europe and whatever and all that was impossible for that to be a civil society. Now, of course, this cuts both ways, see, because the South wanted their civil society to be one in which the superiority of white people would remain, and that was good work, except maybe for some people. But the North, in the North, you have this sense of a certain kind of things falling apart kind of world. But America is that kind of place where as soon as you get somewhere, you're supposed to go from there somewhere else. It has not been a stable place for some time because of all kinds of things that were happening here, and so-called pioneering spirit and moving west and that's been a problem, a real problem. And I don't see it getting any better. I think that Americans have become so jaded with that mode, it's very difficult for them to stop and consider something else. Maybe we always think the new generation of people, maybe the millennials will.
Do we have another student question? Great.
So is the dilemma of religion in America that we draw lines, or what's the
What
dilemma of American religion, is that we draw lines? Is that the dilemma? Better language.
He's a landlord here.
One of you respond to that?
Well, I think that when we discuss religion, too often we don't deal with these fundamental ingredients, the land, and we don't deal with the understanding of the necessity for how different people can come to terms with the land and with the time and I think these are much more important than we ever think. And for the most part, we think that religion only has to do with whether or not you believe in God, you see. Whereas religion really has to do with things much more fundamental and much more concrete, and it's out of that. For example, the reason that the Romans talked about, use the word religare, to bind, to tie together, is because they felt that when you bond together as a family or as a group, that in that bonding certain kinds of actions take place, certain kind of ritual actions take place. And out of those ritual actions, you are able to apprehend those powers that are more than the group and more than the person. So you could say that the deus, the gods, arise out of the binding. See? And so the two go together. Now what we don't have happen in this country, we've never had a binding. We've never had a binding. We've set up a society of contestations so that it's not good to get bound up to those, you know, or they'll sell the company from underneath you. You've seen those movies where my father started this company and now it's grown and whatever, and then this son comes along. You see? And he's not interested in the community, he's just interested in making money. So he's going to sell the company. Because the binding is not tight. And I think that's a real problem we have of the competitive nature of our society, where it's very difficult for there to be the kind of seriousness about the bonds that hold us together.
Can I take one more question, and then we're going to close out? Yes.
So this idea of orientation, and so is this achievable for people in Western society?
What?
The idea of orientation that you stated, how like help being self-aware of like the surroundings and everything like that.
I didn't get the word again.
Orientation.
Orientation.
So is this achievable for Western pretty much people as in Americans to achieve?
Well, orientation, I think everybody can get involved in orientation. Orientation is just finding out where you are and where you want to go.
So would this be like, according to like, would this be related to someone as in Jesus or Buddha, for example? Did this reach this orientation that helped others?
Oh yeah, yeah. But I would say that you know, whether it's Jesus or Buddha or what, if that becomes a part of what enables you to come to terms with where you are and what you want to do, great. You see? Or if it's just, you know, walking around a tree, great. But I think you always have to come to terms with where you are and what does it mean to be there. Because wherever you are, there's something else there beside you. See? And you're going to have to come to terms with being there. See? What does it mean to be here in this place? What does that mean? And what is possible and what is the limitation of being in this place? And how can I be here given its possibilities and its limitations?
Okay, is there any student that's dying to ask a question, and then we'll close it up? No? Well, let's give Dr. Baum There's also a reception outside, so please eat and drink, and if you want to come and talk to Dr. Baum, it's right here.